In the quiet suburbs of Chicago during the 1970s, the concept of a monster living next door was something reserved for fiction. Norwood Park Township was a place of manicured lawns, hard-working families, and a sense of pervasive safety. It was the kind of community where neighbors knew each other, where block parties were common, and where trust was a given currency. At the center of this community stood a man who seemed to embody the very essence of civic duty and success. He was a successful building contractor, a precinct captain for the local political party, and a man who dedicated his weekends to entertaining sick children in hospitals, dressed as a character he created, called Pogo the Clown. His name was John Wayne Gacy. To the outside world, Gacy was a gregarious, albeit sometimes overbearing, pillar of the community. He was named Man of the Year by the local Junior Chamber of Commerce. He hosted grand summer parties attended by local politicians and law enforcement officers. Yet, beneath the floorboards of his modest brick ranch house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue, lay a secret that would eventually shatter the American psyche and rewrite the textbooks on criminal psychology. This is not a story of a sudden snap insanity, but rather a chilling account of a calculated, dual existence. It is the story of how diligent police work, forensic persistence, and the courage of a grieving mother finally brought an end to the dark career of one of history's most deceptive predators. The unraveling of John Wayne Gacy's carefully constructed facade began not with a dramatic standoff, but with a mundane errand on a cold December evening in 1978. 15-year-old Robert Piest was a hard-working student who held a part-time job at the niche pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. On December 11th, Robert was finishing his shift. It was a typical winter night, the air biting and dark. Robert's mother, Elizabeth Piest, had arrived to pick him up. She waited in her car, watching the storefront, expecting her son to emerge at any moment. Inside the pharmacy, Robert mentioned to a coworker that he was going to speak with a contractor about a potential summer construction job. The contractor was currently in the store, doing renovations. Robert told his mother to wait just a few minutes. He stepped back inside, and then he walked out toward the contractor's vehicle. That was the last time Elizabeth Piest would ever see her son. When Robert failed to return to the car after 20 minutes, maternal intuition turned into panic. Elizabeth went into the store, then checked the back. She called his friends. By the time she contacted the Des Plaines Police Department, she was certain that Robert had not simply run away. This unwavering belief in her son's reliability was the spark that ignited the investigation. Unlike many previous cases involving missing young men in the area, which had been dismissed as runaways or youth seeking adventure, the disappearance of Robert Piest was treated with immediate suspicion by the authorities. The investigation fell to Lieutenant Joseph Kozenczak of the Des Plaines Police. Kozenczak was a seasoned investigator who trusted his instincts. When he learned that Robert had gone to speak with a contractor, he immediately sought the identity of that man. The name given was John Wayne Gacy. On the surface, Gacy was cooperative. When contacted by the police the following morning, he sounded surprised and helpful. He admitted to being at the pharmacy, but claimed he had never spoken to the boy and had left alone. However, Kozenczak felt that something was amiss. Gacy's demeanor was too practiced, too dismissive. The lieutenant decided to run a background check, a standard procedure that yielded a startling result. Gacy had a prior conviction in Iowa from 1968 for a crime involving a teenage boy. He had served time in prison. This revelation shattered the image of the benevolent businessman and placed Gacy squarely in the crosshairs of the Des Plaines Police Department. What followed was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse that lasted for 10 days. It was a period of intense psychological warfare. Kozenczak assigned a surveillance team to watch Gacy 24 hours a day. They followed him to work, to restaurants, and even as he went about his daily errands. Gacy, realizing he was being watched, did not cower. Instead, he displayed a level of arrogance that baffled the officers. He would wave at them, invite them into restaurants for breakfast, and even brag about his political connections, threatening that their careers would be over if they continued to harass a respectable citizen. During this surveillance period, the officers noted strange behaviors. Gacy was erratic. He would drive at high speeds, make sudden turns to lose the tail, and then pull over and wait for them to catch up, laughing. But beneath the bravado, the pressure was mounting. Gacy knew that the disappearance of Robert Piest had drawn eyes upon him that would not easily look away. The turning point came when investigators began looking closer at Gacy's timeline on the night of December 11th. They interviewed his employees and associates. Contradictions began to emerge. Gacy claimed he was at home when he was actually out. He claimed he hadn't seen the boy when witnesses placed them together. Armed with these inconsistencies and the prior record, Lieutenant Kozenczak secured a search warrant for the house on Summerdale Avenue. The execution of the first search warrant was a pivotal moment in forensic history. When officers entered the home, they were immediately struck by the mundane, almost tacky normality of the interior. There were paintings of clowns, heavy drapes, and a bar area. However, there was something else, a distinct, heavy odor that permeated the house. It was a smell of decomposition, faint but undeniable to experienced officers. Gacy explained it away as a sewage backup and moisture in the heater, a problem he claimed he was fixing. While they did not find Robert Piest during that first search, they found items that sent chills down their spines. In a jewelry box, they discovered a high school class ring. It did not belong to Gacy. It belonged to a young man named Kozenczak, who had gone missing nearly a year prior. They also found a receipt for a photo processing roll that had been in the pocket of another missing young man. These were trophies. They were tangible links to disappearances that had gone cold. The police confiscated cars, receipts, and other potential evidence. Among the items seized was a receipt from the niche pharmacy, dated December 11th, found in Gacy's trash. This directly placed him at the scene of Piest's disappearance, contradicting his earlier statements. The psychological pressure on Gacy was now immense. The police were no longer just following him, they were dismantling his life. On December 20th, Gacy's erratic behavior peaked. He was observed meeting with lawyers, drinking heavily, and making frantic phone calls. The facade of the jovial clown was dissolving, revealing the desperate predator beneath. On December 21st, armed with the discovery of the ring and the pharmacy receipt, police secured a second, more comprehensive search warrant. This time, they were not just looking for Robert Piest. They were looking for evidence of a much larger crime. The smell in the house had grown worse, exacerbated by the heat of the furnace. One of the officers, following the scent, crawled into the bathroom. He noticed the heating duct was loose. When he peered into the crawl space beneath the house, his flashlight beam caught something that defied logic. The earth in the crawl space was not flat. It was disturbed with mounds and depressions. But what caught the officer's eye was a bone. It was not an animal bone. It was unmistakably human. This discovery changed the trajectory of the investigation instantly. It was no longer a missing person case. It was a homicide investigation of unprecedented scale. When confronted with the reality that the police had found the remains, Gacy's resistance collapsed. In a moment that stunned the investigators, he began to talk. He did not just confess to killing Robert Piest. He confessed to killing over 30 young men. The subsequent excavation of the crawl space at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue became a grim milestone in forensic anthropology. The house was cordoned off, and the Des Plaines police, assisted by the Cook County Sheriff's Office and forensic experts, began the arduous task of recovering the victims. The conditions were horrific. The crawl space was cramped, with barely enough room to sit up. The smell was overpowering. It was the middle of a brutal Chicago winter, and the ground was freezing. Yet the heat from the house had accelerated decomposition in certain areas. Dr. Robert Stein, the Cook County medical examiner, led the forensic effort. He implemented a grid system, dividing the crawl space into sectors to meticulously map the location of every bone and piece of evidence. This was crucial not just for recovery, but for the upcoming legal proceedings. They needed to prove that these were distinct individuals, buried at different times. Day after day, the body count rose. The world watched in horror as the number climbed from 5 to 10 to 20 and eventually to 29 bodies recovered from the property. 4 other victims were later found in the Des Plaines River, where Gacy had disposed of them after running out of room in the crawl space. The sheer logistics of the crime were baffling. How could one man hide so many bodies in a residential neighborhood without detection? The answer lay in Gacy's manipulation of his environment and his neighbors. He had used layers of lime to mask the smell. He had poured concrete over some of the graves. He had utilized the trenches he dug for drainage to hide his victims. And perhaps most disturbingly, he had relied on the trust people placed in him. When neighbors complained of smells, he blamed the sewage. When they saw him digging, he claimed he was doing home improvements. The identification of the victims was a forensic marathon. In 1978, DNA profiling as we know it today did not exist. Dr. Stein and his team relied on dental records, skeletal X-rays, and personal effects found with the bodies. They worked tirelessly to match the remains with missing persons reports. Tragically, many of the victims had been estranged from their families or were labeled as runaways, which had delayed the initial searches for them. The investigators had to reconstruct the lives of these young men, reaching out to families who had spent years in a limbo of uncertainty. As the physical evidence was being cataloged, the legal battle began. Gacy was charged with 33 counts of murder. The trial, which began in February 1980, was not about whether Gacy committed the crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, and he had confessed. The trial was about his state of mind. The defense team argued that Gacy was insane. They painted a picture of a man driven by irresistible impulses, a man whose mind was fractured by a traumatic childhood and repressed desires. They brought in psychiatrists who testified that Gacy suffered from paranoid schizophrenia and could not control his actions during the murders. They tried to separate the man who dressed as a clown to cheer up children from the man who strangled youths with a rope. The prosecution, led by William Kunkel, countered with a narrative of cold, calculated evil. They argued that Gacy was not insane, but a sociopath. They pointed to the planning involved in the murders. Gacy had dug graves in advance. He had prepared the ropes, he had successfully run a business, and maintained a political career while committing these crimes. They emphasized the rope trick, a ruse Gacy used to trick victims into letting him tie them up, demonstrating a high level of deception and cognitive function. The prosecution argued that Gacy knew exactly what he was doing and, more importantly, he knew it was wrong. He hid the bodies, he lied to the police, he tried to cover his tracks. These were the actions of a rational man trying to evade punishment, not a man in the throes of a psychotic break. The jury listened to weeks of testimony. They saw the diagrams of the crawl space, they heard the details of the rope trick, they looked at the mountain of evidence, including the jewelry, the clothing, and the driver's licenses of the victims kept as souvenirs. After deliberations, the jury returned their verdict. They rejected the insanity defense. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty on all 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. The verdict brought a sense of closure to the families, but it could not undo the immense loss. An entire generation of young men from the Chicago area had been decimated. Gacy spent 14 years on death row. During this time, he continued to paint, often depicting clowns, a macabre hobby that only deepened the public's revulsion. He maintained his innocence regarding the intent, claiming it was an accident or a loss of control, but the legal system remained firm. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at the Stateville Correctional Center. His final words were defiant and dismissive, a final act of arrogance from a man who lacked empathy. But the story did not end with Gacy's execution. The legacy of the case profoundly changed American law enforcement and forensic science. The Gacy case highlighted the flaws in the communication systems between different police jurisdictions. Many of the victims had been reported missing in Chicago, but the records were not easily accessible to the suburban police in Des Plaines. This tragedy helped spur the development of better, centralized databases for missing persons and unidentified remains. Furthermore, the case underscored the danger of the runaway label. Because many of the victims were teenagers, their disappearances were initially treated as voluntary. This assumption allowed Gacy to operate for years without significant heat. In the wake of the case, protocols were changed to treat missing youth reports with greater urgency and scrutiny. The forensic work continued long after the house on Summerdale Avenue was demolished. In 2011, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart reopened the investigation to identify the remaining 8 unknown victims. Using modern DNA technology that was unavailable in the 1970s, investigators exhumed the remains of the unidentified John Does. They asked families of young men who had gone missing in that era to provide DNA samples. This modern scientific effort yielded results. Several victims were finally identified, decades after their deaths. Young men like William Bundy and Francis Wayne Alexander were given their names back. These identifications provided final answers to families who had gone to their graves not knowing what happened to their sons or brothers. It was a testament to the idea that justice has no expiration date and that science can eventually shine a light on the darkest of secrets. The site of the murders, the property on Summerdale Avenue, stood empty for years after the house was razed. The stigma of the soil was too great. Eventually, new construction was built and new families moved in, but the address was changed to dissociate the land from its history. Yet, for those who lived through that winter of 1978, the memory remains vivid. The case of the killer clown serves as a permanent reminder of the duality of human nature. It reminds us that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie, manages a business, and shakes hands at political fundraisers. It teaches us that vigilance is the price of safety, and that the instincts of a mother, like Elizabeth Piest, should never be underestimated. When we look back at the investigation, we see the triumph of methodical police work over chaotic evil. Lieutenant Kozenczak and his team did not have the technology we have today. They did not have GPS tracking or instant DNA results. They had shoe leather, intuition, and the determination to find a missing boy. Their refusal to accept Gacy's lies, even when he threatened their jobs, is the true heroic element of this narrative. The tragedy of the 33 lives lost is immeasurable. They were students, workers, sons, and brothers. They had futures that were stolen in moments of calculated cruelty. As we study this case, we do so not to glorify the perpetrator, but to honor the victims and to understand the mechanisms of justice that eventually stopped him. In the end, the Gacy case forces us to ask difficult questions about our communities. How well do we really know the people around us? We often rely on social signals, employment, charm, community status to judge character. But as this case proved, those signals can be manipulated. As you navigate your own life, trusting in the safety of your community, it is worth pausing to consider. If a predator can hide in plain sight, masked by the trappings of a model citizen, what are the true indicators of character we should be looking for? And in a world where we are often strangers to our neighbors, how do we protect the vulnerable among us from those who wear a mask of benevolence?